Great. Now, next up, we have our panel. And let me just introduce first our moderator, Derval MacDonald. Derval is an author, journalist, broadcaster, and documentary filmmaker. She'll be familiar to many of this audience as the former legal affairs editor and group business editor of Independent News and Media. A former Eisenhower Fellow, Derval has won a series of awards for her contribution to public affairs journalism. She's the author of Bust, How the Irish Courts Exposed the Rotten Heart of the Irish Economy, and has used her platforms to consistently highlight a range of diverse issues at the interface of law, business, society, equality, and economics. And on the platform, we have first Dr. Michael O'Flaherty, the Commissioner for Human Rights at the Council of Europe, elected in January of 2024, an Irish human rights lawyer. Commissioner O'Flaherty previously served as the Director of the EU Fundamental Rights Agency, as a member of the United Nations Human Rights Committee, and as Chief Commissioner of the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission. He is currently adjunct full professor at the University of Maynooth and at UCD, and has published widely in the area of human rights. Bernadette Devlin McAliskey has been a campaigner for social justice and human rights all of her adult life. An elder of the Rebel Alliance, she joined the civil rights movement in 1968, was a member of People's Democracy. In 1969, she was elected to Westminster as an independent unity member for Mid-Ulster. In 1970, Bernadette was convicted and served 6 months in Armagh jail for her role in the defence of the Bogside. In 1981, she was seriously wounded in an assassination attempt, as was her husband, in their home where their 3 children were present. Bernadette founded the South Tyrone Empowerment Programme, STEP, a community-based organisation which supports the rights of migrant workers. Tessa Khan is an international climate change and human rights lawyer, campaigner and strategist. Before founding Uplift, she was a member of the legal team of the Urgenda Foundation, a Dutch NGO that was responsible for the first case in the world in which a court ordered a national government to reduce a country's greenhouse gas emissions by an absolute minimum amount. She was also co-founder and co-director of the Climate Litigation Network, a project of Urgenda Foundation, which supports groundbreaking strategic climate litigation around the world. She has spent more than 15 years supporting grassroots, regional and international movements for justice, and has served as an expert advisor to UN human rights bodies and national governments. And the shortest introduction goes to Rose Wall, who, as you know, is CEO of Community Law and Mediation. Please welcome our panel.
We've a bit of northern bias here, but it's all right. Thank you very, very much. Please give a warm welcome again to our panel. When I got the invitation to come along tonight, I've left my legal affairs editor days long behind me. I couldn't say no. I learnt very early on as a law student that saying no to a request by Rose Wall was not a possibility. But too, I'm here to celebrate CLM because it played an integral role in my career as a legal affairs journalist, and indeed in covering public affairs generally. Colin Daly, as he then was, will know that I spent many afternoons out in Coolock torturing him for yarns and for stories. But it was the law centres and the legal NGOs and Coolock Law Centre in particular, which really acted as the canaries in the coal mine for us as journalists, that really helped us identify the legal issues, be educated about them. I didn't know what a Chancery Summons Court was until I was educated about that. It is, of course, better known as the Repossessions Court. We learned about issues of, discrimination, about, civil and legal aid, social aid, and it was just listening to the former Chief Justice, Mr. Justice Frank Clark, reference a very, very important test case. It was due to Coolock Law Centre at the time that I actually got to break the Caroline McCann case, which was one of the most consequential cases. I know people have probably heard me speak about it before, but the current Chief Justice obviously was representing pro bono at that time. But to be in court as that vulnerable woman gave testimony to say, you know, that she had got into debt, including for, among other matters, to pay for her newborn baby's funeral, and having the air sucked out of that courtroom that day, but to see the challenge between a vulnerable person and the state, and the central importance of our law centres and providing that critical support, not just in strategic litigation, but it really felt at that time that we were bearing witness to history, because of course the state had stood over that legislation for quite a long period of time. So I am in your debt and continue to be, so it's wonderful for me to be here. I think I've got about 15 minutes for the panel, so I don't know, I could do probably an hour with each one of our guests. But Michael, I'm going to start with you first, because you're in the news. I know you've got a very, very broad remit, and there's a lot under your leadership, and I know that's ever expanding. But your recent memorandum on 3 countries, including Ireland, in respect of Roman travellers was quite the memo.
Yeah, we have a huge issue right across Europe. 12 million members of the Roma and traveller community across the 46 member states of the Council of Europe. Problems everywhere, problems of respect for human rights. But they're different everywhere. And what I've done, I've visited 8 countries since I took up this job to look at the 8 different experiences. And I came to Ireland back home particularly to look at the situation of travellers. I wanted to make sure that was not overlooked in the study. And what did I find? Well, some people here have
You gave us some credit.
Yeah, but rightly so. I find the difference in attitude really remarkable in a decade, because I would have had conversations 10, 12 years ago about these issues, but I didn't get the resistance and pushback that I would have been used to back then, and that's matched by serious planning. I mean, there really is a deliberate effort to get the planning in place to deliver the difference in housing, health, education, the justice system. The problem is there's still such a long way to go to deliver it.
You said the progress has been thwarted on the ground. What did you mean by that?
We're racist. And until we acknowledge the extent of racism within ourselves, and I mean, I include myself, until we acknowledge that, we won't fix it. Because that means that every time we engage on the issue of the situation of the travellers, there's a maybe but, or an if, or an ambiguity. And I think that comes from some deep racist tendency inside ourselves. Until we fix that, we're not going to fix the problem. Yeah. And because also essential to fixing the situation is working with the traveller community to fix it. It's not about being for them, it's working in partnership.
You called for stronger political commitment to overcome that entrenchment, I think is how you described it in your memorandum. What does that look like in practice? Look, you're talking there sometimes about something that's very hard to shift, which is those underlying attitudes, cultures and beliefs. But there are still tangible things like legislation, and I know that you were looking at no movement yet on the trespass legislation. So what does that political commitment look like for you?
It looks like our top leaders speaking about the issue, speaking about it persistently and constantly, regardless of whether it is or is not popular, challenging us, reminding us of what basic decency requires from us. Never mind human rights, just basic decency in how we treat each other. If we get that loud and persistent enough, by the way, not just from the government, but right across the political spectrum, then I think that we'll shift the rest. We'll have that momentum to get serious. One other dimension. When we see racism, when we see hate, when that racism and hate crosses the criminal line, we need to see accountability. People who violate our hate crime-related legislation have to carry the consequences. Not enough of that yet. And by the way, that's a Europe-wide issue.
Rose, of course, you're seeing this on the ground, all of your mediators, your lawyers, all of those volunteers. What else needs to change? And what progress has been made, as you see it?
Yeah, I suppose in terms of what needs to change, I mean, I suppose what we would see a lot in our work, we operate in this rules-based system, and that those rules affect us all in everything that we do, whether it's our health, our housing, our education. But what we see in our work are where that rules-based system is failing so many. And it's failing so many because sometimes the rules are unfair. It's failing so many because sometimes the rules can't be figured out or understood, but it's also failing so many because lots of those in power and in authority are not following their own rules. So one of the services we run, for example, we run a legal advice clinic for members of the traveller community who Michael mentioned. And some of the cases coming through the clinic include, just for example, a mum who had to flee her home with her 7 children due to domestic violence and was refused access to emergency accommodation due to an incorrectly applied local connection rule. We also assisted a family with 2 children with very significant medical needs living in a trailer with no running water, no electricity, no heat, and no access to sanitation. And we helped a widow who booked a table in a restaurant for her and her family and were refused access because they're members of the traveller community. So in some of those cases, it's the rules that are the problem. We have no civil legal aid for discrimination cases before the WRC. We have trespass legislation that doesn't allow for a nomadic way of life. We have no local authority rental scheme, for example, for trailers and mobile homes. But in some instances, the rules are actually really good. We have, equality legislation, but we still have systematic daily discrimination of travellers. And we have housing legislation there, but we still have, for example, traveller accommodation programmes that don't meet their statutory requirements. So sometimes the rules are good, but sometimes the rules just aren't followed.
Can I move you, Bernadette? Truth and justice and an equitable, inclusive society are still to be achieved, and peace comes dropping slow. If you know that quote, you've been to the Ulster Museum, where Bernadette Devlin McAliskey is now an artefact. An artefact. An absolute artefact and elder, as we heard, of the Rebel Alliance. Look, you've been a lifelong campaigner. I think you make the comment now that you're being paid now for what you and your family were getting shot at for many, many years ago. Can I just ask you, you heard, like the former Chief Justice was just talking about how, the system hadn't worked for some people. It's still not working for many people. And after a lifetime of campaigning, do you ever get saddened or angry or frustrated that sometimes it feels as if we haven't progressed as far as we would like?
Yeah, well, I think for a start, I think the system works for very few people. We always start by saying that, the system doesn't work for everybody. It works for hardly anybody. The system is a system that is based on hierarchy and privilege. And times now are very hard. Mm-hmm. And people live under pressures, social pressures, economic pressures, mental health, physical health pressures, that a generation, 2 generations ago, a larger number of individuals, families, and communities were able to deal with. And personally, I think that's because the state has diminished itself in its role for the protection of the citizens and the protection of the citizens' rights equitably and with social justice. And we see that now because more and more people are being pitted one against the other. Everybody is finding somebody else to blame. And if you're in the middle, you're blaming the people below you and the people above you. And if you're in the bottom, you're blaming horizontally across the bottom because you can't even figure out the system. And it's not because you don't have the intelligence. It's not because you don't have this great word, the capacity. It's you don't have the time. Because you have no idea how much time being on the receiving end of poverty, hatred, discrimination takes in surviving. So do I get angry? At some point, possibly every day, certainly every week. Am I sad? At some point, every day, possibly every week. And as Father Des Wilson in Belfast used to say, the day we lose the capacity to be outraged, we have lost. So yes, I do all of those things. And paradoxically, none of them last for any length of time, because I'm really motivated with getting even. And I don't mean in terms of revenge, but I think when we were all students and I see my own inspirational mentor in the second row there, Michael Farrell, who led us in the student movement. you know, and who, like, you know, like myself and almost everybody else, paid dearly in a personal sense for doing that, and had to actually move down here, and you all benefited from our loss, but we won't hold that against you. So yes, do I get frustrated? Do I get angry? Do I call vengeance upon a God I don't even believe exists to come down upon the heads of perpetrators? Yes. But just doing that isn't going to change anything. So I kind of steel myself again, and I know, and I recognize it isn't about me. This is a collective effort.
And it is precisely about that, because that's what STEP is about. But Rose, it was so interesting to listen to one of your colleagues on the video, you know, just saying that it's actually just about being with that person who doesn't have the energy, who doesn't have the ability, and it's not, again, it's not because they don't have the intelligence, but they're just so worn down by the challenges, often multifaceted, that they face.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, we heard from Ethna in the video telling her and her son Cormac's story. And Ethna had all of the information at her disposal, and she was, you know, more than capable of you know, using that information to push her case forward. And as she said in the video, you know, she ticked every box there was, but she couldn't get anywhere. And she needed extra help for that. And often we see in our work where we're advising somebody who is trying to challenge an incorrect decision or an injustice, and they're in that moment going through a really difficult time in their lives, and they're often trying to navigate a really technical area of law, and then they're often up against a more powerful opponent, and you need help for that. You can't do that always on your own. Sometimes you can, but often you can't. And I suppose just to kind of pick up on another point is you know, how we reach people in our services, because accessibility is a big thing, and how we do that is through partnerships, actually. And I think Liam Cohen from the Department of Justice is here tonight, because one of the things he talks about, rather than hard to reach groups, it's hard to reach services. And so, like, to give you an example, one of the services we provide, and we'd like to do more of, is a legal service for children and young people. And you know, one of the things we've learned from that, and from research that Roisin Webb is doing on that, is that if you want to reach children and young people, you have to work through organisations that they trust. And so when we want to reach, for example, young care leavers or children in care, it's not enough to circulate some leaflets and put up some posts on social media. We are working with EPIC, an amazing organisation working in this area, where we talk to them about what issues they're seeing, how the law can help. They identify young people who need that help. They make appointments with us. They attend those appointments with the young person. And it's about bringing the law to people, because, as you say, Bernadette, you know, when you're up against it, it's really challenging and it's really difficult to seek that out yourself.
Tessa, you've been on quite a journey as a lawyer, because many people in this room will know you from your earlier work, you know, in gender equality, you know, women's rights, all of that. And you're now working on climate justice. And I'm just wondering, was that a big plot twist for you, or actually was there sort of a kind of an inevitable you know, march towards that?
Yeah, thanks so much, Devil. And I just want to say how delighted I am to be here celebrating community law and mediation. What a privilege it is to just be up here with such inspirational company. So you're right. I mean, I started my career as a human rights lawyer and campaigner working in different parts of the world. And about 15 years ago, I was living in Thailand, working on behalf of a regional women's rights network, really focused on issues of gender equality and justice. And it became increasingly clear to me that both with the sort of extreme weather events, typhoons and cyclones and so on, that are affecting Asia particularly, as well as the slower onset effects of climate change, sea level rise, you know, decreasing rainfall and so on, that all of those affect women in a disproportionate way, and that's borne out by lots of research that shows that, you know, if you're a woman, for example, you're 10 times more likely to die in a natural disaster. Women have fewer social and economic resources that allow them to recover. There are big spikes in domestic violence after extreme weather events, and women's, you know, bear a disproportionate burden of the care work in homes that often increases in the aftermath of those sorts of events. So, you know, it was very clear to me in my work that it was fundamentally a human rights issue, and the more I worked on climate change as an issue, it just became increasingly evident that it's really not just about women's rights. It is a threat to all social and economic equality, and so many of the gains that we've made not just in the global south, but globally in terms of our resilience and as I said, social and economic justice, really, that it is, even for the communities where it's not an existential threat, and those communities do exist, and that's an issue that's going to materialise in just the next couple of decades. It's something that no country, no community, no person is immune from because of the trajectory we're currently on in terms of our changing climate. So it seemed to me like a very obvious thing to focus my energy on.
And again, it is those, the poorest, the most vulnerable, those who are worn down by all of those challenges, who are being impacted the most and who are being left to take on the climate challenge because of a lack of political leadership and also leadership in the corporate world. Like, I mean, just today, one of the world's major PLCs just announced that, hey, it's going back. It's going back, and reversing all of that and going back to fossil fuels. Does that, are you concerned about that trend?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is why I think, climate change is an issue of justice along so many different axes, because it is about not just the fact that the world's richest countries who have been responsible for most of the pollution that's contributing to climate change are the ones who for now are the most insulated from the impact. But as you say, it's also the world's most powerful companies, the world's richest people who are responsible for a disproportionate volume of greenhouse gas emissions. And they're the ones who for now at least have the resources to insulate themselves from the impact. So, it's fundamentally a justice issue.
Has anyone read Kim Stanley Robinson's Cli-Fi novel, The Ministry of the Future? Yeah, it's absolutely fantastic. It reminds me of Rose Wall. So if you haven't read it, it's a dystopian story about an international climate crisis body led suspiciously by a former Irish foreign minister. I think she's called Mary Murphy in it. But it's very interesting because this international climate crisis body was charged with defending all living creatures present and future who cannot speak for themselves. It was on Obama's list. That's how I ended up reading it. It is absolutely stunning. And then I just was trying to look, when did that book come out? And when did Rose Wall decide to set up this first ever climate Centre for Climate and Environmental Justice? But it was very, very sort of groundbreaking, Rose, when you did that at the time. And perhaps maybe people are thinking, well, that's not, kind of work in, civil legal aid or, travellers in Roma or anything. What were you thinking when you brought the centre, and were you the source for Kim Stanley Robinson?
Haven't read the book. But I suppose that looking at the why, there's three things to say. The climate crisis is the defining crisis of our time. Mm-hmm. And Ireland will not be immune. We mightn't face the same existential threat, but Ireland will not be immune and will impact and is impacting a broad range of human rights. The second thing is, it's a classic case of same storm, different boats. Certain groups will be impacted more than others because those who are most marginalised have the fewest choices about where and how they live, they have the fewest resources to cope with climate change, and they have the least visibility in the shaping of policy responses. And just to take an example, when you look at some of the polluting causes of climate change and who are affected by those, it's the children, it's the elderly, it's those with disabilities. And if you look at those who are most impacted by adverse weather caused by climate change, it's people living in trailers, it's homeless people sleeping rough. And so those are groups that access our services. The third thing to say is, while we have achieved some good things, we are way off course in terms of what needs to be done. Ireland is the third worst per capita emitter in Europe in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and our own Environmental Protection Agency forecasts that we're going to be up to 27% overshooting our legally binding carbon budgets. So, I mean, the gap between what we have committed to doing and what we should be doing is widening, and the road is running out. And the faster we hurtle towards that cliff edge, the harder the brakes are going to have to be hit. And by then, not only might it be too late, but instead of a just transition where you can help struggling households with energy costs, with better access to transport, better access to green space, what you have instead is a disruptive, disorderly, and abrupt transition that causes real risks for underserved communities. So we set up the centre, and one of the things we want to do is to make sure that policy reflects the needs of the community that we work with, but we also want to hold power to account through strategic litigation. And I just want to mention one case really briefly, which I think goes to the heart of the novel you mentioned. We're involved in a case which is still before the courts, and it is really significant for a number of reasons, but one reason I want to mention is it's the first time in our 50-year history where we are the client, we are the applicant, and in that we're joined by a grandfather, by a youth climate activist, by an infant. And why we are taking this case is we are speaking on behalf of the communities that we serve. We're speaking on behalf of travellers living in trailers, of people sleeping rough, but we also are speaking on behalf of future generations who are going to be impacted most by climate inaction.
Thank you. Michael, even before the conflict in the Middle East, we were enduring the highest level of armed conflict since World War II. We have war in the European continent. We're seeing the rise of fascism and far-right politics being mainstreamed all over Europe and in other parts of the world. I think it's fair to say the mood music for human rights and social justice is not very good right now. What are your broader priorities for Europe and what's coming through for you?
Yeah, well, I agree with your assessment. It's the worst time I've seen in my entire adult life for standing up for human rights. I'm very clear, though, on what the priorities need to be. The first is stand up for the human rights of the people of Ukraine, and I'm extremely worried this week. I have no idea what's going on. I think we're all the same. We're following the story on the media, but I don't see any reference to human rights. I don't see any reference to the people in the occupied territories, any reference to the civilians who've been killed. Any reference to all those people displaced who aren't living, they have no accommodation, no access to schools, and so on. It's really imperative, and it's part of my job to work with others to bring human rights back to the table. So that's core to the discussion of whatever outcome we're going to have in Ukraine. Remember, it's not just about the human rights of the people of Ukraine, it's about the human rights of everybody on this continent. The whole continent is being challenged by the aggressor, and if that aggressor wins, we all lose. And by the way, Ukraine owes us nothing. We owe it the deepest debt of gratitude for standing up to the tyrant. And so it's a really dangerous week, actually, for this top issue. But second, and not unrelated, there's the issue of defending the human rights system that we have. It's under extraordinary risk. And I'm particularly worried in the past 12 months because of a new qualitative change. It's not just about violations. It's not just about the extremes doing extreme stuff. It's the center.
Yeah,
I see a willingness to concede in the centre, which is very disturbing. A willingness of otherwise moderate governments to say, we will violate international law at our borders. We will send people back into risk of persecution. Things that would have been unthinkable, even, as I say, literally a year ago. And as Yeats said, the centre cannot hold, things fall apart. And so this is a moment to protect what's been achieved. It's unique. It's the only universally shared language to honour human dignity.
And Tessa, your work is in part trying to not, to hold the centre, but also to, as we said, it's falling to people who aren't, I suppose, enabled to hold governments to account. You have seen successes and you've been involved in some of those successes. Is there anything sort of inspiring and maybe optimistic you can divine from that might be useful for us to know? Any insights?
Yeah, well, of course I'm optimistic. We saw in that fantastic film, and by the way, congratulations on 50 years, but in the great film we were reminded of the Erie case.
Yes.
That's a success. And our countries are made up of so many of these successes, which cumulatively have delivered so much. Remember, the enjoyment of respect for human rights is honoured in the silence and in you know what I mean. It's the violations that get the attention. It's all those little wins every day that we take for granted because of cases like Erie that we tend to overlook. That's the first reason I remain optimistic. The second is that ultimately the driver of respect for human rights is our communities, our populations, and they're decent. Everybody here knows it from our work and our engagements. People are fundamentally good. There's a desire for fairness and justice and things of that nature.
And
strong
do you
in
agree,
society.
Tessa, with that? Do you think that's... Sorry, I'll just ask
But can I just finish?
Yeah.
We need to marshal it.
Yeah.
It's not good enough to say there's lots of goodwill and people are nice. They need a roadmap. And human rights can be that roadmap if it's effectively communicated.
What is the roadmap, Tessa Khan? I was thinking of, I was so inspired by the Swiss grannies, as they were sort of known in terms of the case that they took on their behalf and on behalf of older women. But do you see successes? What sort of motivates you in terms of what Michael has described as marshalling that goodwill and marshalling communities?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think there are huge prospects for progress and for pushing back against the against a kind of tide of despair that we're dealing with on multiple fronts. I think specifically for climate change, there have been so many legal cases recently, including the one that you've mentioned in the European Court of Human Rights, that I think have really put into concrete terms what people feel at a gut level, which is that when governments fail to address climate change, to take it seriously, that it is a violation of their rights. I think so many of us are deeply concerned and have a sense that, our governments do have duties to protect us. We may not know, if we're not lawyers, what they are, but surely it can't be right that there is a foreseeable tremendous risk, which is what climate change represents, that we know exactly what's causing it, that governments are often facilitating that. There has to be some kind of remedy or recourse for those of us who are facing that threat. And I think climate change litigation has been really helpful for articulating and clarifying exactly what those protections are, and that, all of us are entitled to call on those protections. So I think, that's just one way in which I think people have really got a path forward.
After the last financial crash, Bernadette and I were on stage at some event in Dublin, and things were very morose, and people were very, very sort of upset at what was happening. And somebody asked Bernadette, what do you do when you're stuck and when it feels as if we don't have any power? And I've been quoting her answer for the last 15 years, because Bernadette says, "You dig where you stand," and I've been quoting her for the last 15 years. And a few days ago, she told me that it wasn't her quote. I think you had liberated it from somebody else. But I've been quoting her for the last 15 years as Bernadette Devlin McAliskey says, "You dig where you stand."
Well, I said because somebody told me that's what you do, right back. And I think it was black organisers when I was thrown into the mesh of America and witnessed racism. When you actually go somewhere and you're trying to say something, and there it is in front of you, and you have to do something about it. Because I was going to meetings, people from Ireland, Irish Americans were turning up, and then they were saying, "Don't talk about blacks, don't talk about socialism, and don't criticise the church." And I said, "Well, what am I doing? What am I doing here? Is this a flower arranging class?" But I was really gobsmacked by it, because you live in your own shelter. It wasn't a very racially diverse community. I grew up alongside and respecting members of the traveller community, and so I was aware of that. I was aware of that prejudice. I didn't even know to call it racism, because it didn't look on travellers as being different from me. But it was that's where I heard it, and I think that's what you do have to do. A lot of people are great at discovering that somebody would need to do something about it. Something's wrong, and somebody would need to. And I think there has to be a realization that somebody might just be you if you look around and there's not anybody else doing it. And then you say, well, what can I do? Probably not a lot on your own. But if you dig where you stand, you can talk to your neighbour, you can talk to your fellow lawyer, you can talk to the woman down the street, talk to the man in the pub, who also thinks somebody ought to do something. And that's the two of you who might come up with something that could be done. And you've no sooner thought of the idea till somebody already knows. Somebody's already doing that. So that's great. Who are they? And we could go and join them. There is a problem that somebody who's doing it might say, "You're not allowed, I was here first." So you have to negotiate that bit. But I think the important thing to realize is, while we all are suffering from different bits of the problem is the one problem. And how it manifests itself in all of our lives is different. The thing that frightens me to an extent about where we are is, as Michael has said, look no further than this island, a part of it in the United Kingdom, part of it a republic. And it's led by centrists. You know, government, the same old's back in government, and Keir Starmer has taken the Labour Party back sort of to the centre right. And these are the people who are telling us that we must live with a diminishing of our human rights in order to protect them. And that's a line we're being sold. In order to protect all of our human rights, we'll have to sacrifice the most of them. And we will have to step outside the infrastructure of human rights that was created after the last war to end wars. So we have our own Minister of Foreign Affairs now, Simon Harris, basically talking about undoing the triple lock so that we can bypass the United Nations. We have the European Union talking about putting peacekeepers into Ukraine. That's a job of the United Nations. You know, if we're going to do those things, we have the mechanism there. And it is the centre, it's not the people on the street, you know, burning down asylum seeker, refugee shelters, who are dismantling the United Nations and deliberately dismantling it. It is the centre governments of Europe and following into what the United States of America, never mind Trump. And it's difficult to know whether Trump is a fascist or the buffoon, or Musk is the fascist or the buffoon, or whether both of them are simply pawns in a game of people behind them.
And yet they have the support of a lot of people.
But it was Biden and the Democrats who dismantled the United Nations in the matter of Israel, and now do not have a strong United Nations to take on Russia.
Can I ask you something about progress? Because you've a long history of campaigning across so many issues. Is progress sometimes holding what you have? Or, you know, just in terms of this moment we're in, is that sometimes progress rather than perhaps even making those advances?
I think it's a crucial part of it. James Connolly said, you know, agitate, organise and educate. He was right, but he forgot to say consolidate. And I think that sometimes the best we can do is strengthen the ground we're standing on and refuse to be pushed back. And if you can hold the line, and part of where we are at the minute is holding the line. The best you can do in some areas is hold the line and see in what areas, by holding the line here, if you can't move forward, which is what many of us did in the building of the post-conflict peace. If you can't move forward, move sideways. But whatever you do, try not to be pushed back.
Tessa, can I ask you, Tessa won the prestigious Climate Breakthrough Award, and something was very interesting when you accepted the award. You said, we all have agency. You know, we all have agency and we can all make a difference. I think you said the history of social change will tell you that you can win through social movements. And I was just wondering, what is your advice to those who are perhaps disheartened and feeling perhaps disempowered, just even by the sheer scale of things that are coming at us at the moment, from your own life experience?
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that we're in a really challenging moment. I actually think in some ways, you know, for those of us who work on climate justice, that some of the developments in recent months, including oil and gas companies kind of dropping any pretense of being interested in transitioning to renewable energy, aligning themselves very clearly with Trump and his allies, is quite clarifying, and that's useful. I mean, I think if you're going to win a fight, you have to kind of know exactly what the terrain is that you're fighting on, and I think now things are much clearer than they were a year ago to even the most casual observer. who sort of our allies are and who our adversaries are, and that's helpful. I guess, I think that there is still so much to really recommend continuing to push for progress, even in the face of the sort of resistance we're currently facing. I mean, we all know that, addressing climate change, averting climate disaster is almost at the bottom of the list of all of the good things that we can enjoy if we address climate change. It's cleaner air, it's more affordable energy, it's energy security, it's warmer homes, all of these benefits that can accrue to ordinary people in the short term. All of that is still true, and so there are so many different ways in which we can kind of prosecute the argument that we've got to take this crisis seriously. I also think that it's a moment that I hope will really call on so many of us in different sectors fighting on behalf of different movements across different identities to work together and to collaborate in a way that we've never done before, to create the biggest intersectional movement that we've ever had. Because I think if there's anything that the last few months have taught us, it's that politics at the moment is being shaped by the people with the biggest platform and the loudest microphones. And the only way we can amplify our voices is if we do that collectively. And so I think that's really incumbent on all of us, and that is a way through.
Rose, can I just ask you, look, obviously we've spoken tonight about, all of the tools available to you, including strategic litigation, but there are so many other kind of tools available, including collaboration and non-sort of court options or non-litigation options to marshal people together and get behind those movements.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose we do lots of different things in CLM outside of our litigation work. We have a mediation and conflict coaching service, which is really important, where what you're talking about are relationships and communication, helping people to find a path forward themselves. But we also do work in partnership with a lot of organisations, just to pick up on Tessa's point, because we can't do it alone. The problems are too big and we are small. As much as we'd like to get more funding and grow, we are small. And so we work in partnerships with a lot of people in this room and beyond, because otherwise we couldn't do what we need to do. But there are other tools. We obviously have our kind of strategic litigation, which is a really important part of what we do, but so many of our cases don't get that far. So many of our cases are smaller interventions, but that can have a really big impact, where you have in your back pocket the threat of litigation, which is really important. But another thing to say, and I think it's something that we could do better, is to talk about our work. So when you go to court, when you have a positive court outcome, when you have a negative court outcome, you need to talk about it. In the case of negative court outcomes, you need to say, this is where the law needs to change. In the case of positive court outcomes, you need to say, if you're in this boat, you can challenge this. And if you have those responsibilities, if you're somebody sitting in a different office, a different department, a different workplace, and you've done this too, you can be held to account. But the other kind of facet of it as well is to engage with the political system. So it's not just enough to engage with the courts. You can't always get the case you need to take. And even if you do get the case, you still need to engage with the political system. And just to give an example of where we have had to do that in recent years, we had a couple of years ago, and some of our team in the room here tonight were really affected by it, where a number of years ago, Limerick City and County Council introduced a policy where they decided there were additional criteria to satisfy and qualify for emergency accommodation. And one of those things was that you couldn't intentionally have made yourself homeless. And the impact of that on the ground was absolutely catastrophic. We had women presenting to our services who were sleeping in Garda stations, sleeping in cars, having left their homes because of domestic violence, that were being denied access to emergency accommodation. And we had to tackle that through lots of fronts. We had to bring in partners, we had to act collectively, we had to put pressure through kind of intensive activism, and we had to threaten litigation, leading to it being overturned. So it's kind of lots of different things at the same time.
And what's happening, Michael, at a community level, so at the national and international, you said recently it's time to rally, to imbue each other with urgency and strengthen the human rights system with more resolve. What steps do you think need to be taken at an international level to encourage that collective action to defend human rights and strengthen the human rights system, when, as Bernadette has pointed out, that many of the aggressors now are those governments themselves?
Yeah. A lot of what we need to do has been discussed right across the panel in the last hour. But the first thing we have to do is a personal thing. We have to get very angry. Stéphane Hessel, the French intellectual, wrote a pamphlet about the attacks on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and he called it Indignez-vous, get furious. And I believe he was absolutely right. It's only when we are furious at what we risk losing that we'll take the necessary action. But then we have to get smart. There's been an awful lot of talk about smart action up here. Yeah, you know, all this strategic litigation has done and makes such an enormous difference. Look at the Swiss case, the environment case at the European Court. This is now triggering countless copycat actions, which is exactly what it's meant to do. Copycat actions, not just in Europe, but across the world. We've talked about a lot of sectors. Another one I want to flag tonight is oversight of artificial intelligence. It's no less important as an issue that must be engaged in a climate of a pushback against regulation with potentially catastrophic consequences for all of us. The last thing I would say, and I learned this from Bernadette, when I first met you about 15 years ago, it's the thing I took away from that first conversation. We're only as good as our willingness and our effort to stand up for the most forgotten and the most marginalized people. And you know, we must, every one of us in our different roles, have to interrogate ourselves. Are we looking for that person in our mandate, in our role, and what are we doing to support them, their dignity and their human rights? And if we ever want to know the group, maybe if we're a bit stuck to find a group, see what Bernadette Devlin McAliskey is up to, because it's probably the right place to be.
It probably is. It was the complexity of economic, social and political problems of Northern Ireland that threw up the phenomenon of Bernadette Devlin, and thank God for that in many respects. But you chose The Price of My Soul as the name for your autobiography, and rather about the price we all have to pay in our own lives to preserve our own integrity and that of our neighbour. I'll throw you the last question, and hopefully I'll be quoting you right for the next 15 years. What is your advice as we look to tackle the problems of our age?
You know, I think it's the same. I think it's something I discovered. You know, when I was a student, I thought, and I think many of us thought, Michael, when we were students, that we'd get this sorted and then we'd get back
to
and do a bit of studying, and we might pass an exam or two and be allowed to stay. But there's a point when you start with activism. I think the majority of people start to change something because it is hurting them or somebody who matters to them. But once you begin to do something about it, you learn and you begin to grow. And you realize it's not just about you, and it's not just about the people you care about. And one of the things that we then did when was, you know, our fundamental position in STEP was, you know, people have rights. So you identify yourself as the rights bearer, and you just keep pulling on that rope to see both who has the duty of care and protection for you of that right. And there's a point where you realize that you also then are looking for other people who are denied the same right because you're going to build an alliance with them, where you realize that you are also the civic duty bearer for everybody else for a right that you want for yourself, because it's a human right. It's not an Irish right. It's not a traveller right. It's not a woman's right. It's a human right which you are being denied because of your particular position. But the fundamental right belongs to everybody, and that's how you start from the bottom. But I think what I would say to people is you can avoid being interested till it comes to your doorstep. But once it comes to your doorstep, you will sooner or later realize you are embarked on a lifetime commitment to make the world a better place. If you have no intention of doing that, when it comes to your doorstep, get under the bed and hide. That's all. That's like it won't work.
It won't work. And
once you become involved in making something better, whether you like it or not, you will continue to develop. And then you realize that climate change, climate justice, women's justice, the rights of travellers, the rights of immigrants, right, are all bound up in the same struggle to make the world a better, more equitable and fairer place. And then we're down, you know. And I just so you know, it wasn't me said it. It was Gramsci said it in the 1920s. The old world is dying, and a new world is struggling to be born. This is the time of monsters. But it is also the time for the rest of us not to be afraid of monsters and to bring the new world into being.
And what a phenomenal citation to finish on. I just love that image of the fact that we are all duty bearers, and what a privilege it has been for me on your behalf to facilitate this celebration of one of the greatest duty bearers in our society, CLM. Please give a very big thank you to Tessa, to Michael, to Rose, and of course to Bernadette Devlin McAliskey.
Now, I'm delighted to welcome poet Colm Keegan. Colm's an award-winning writer and poet from Dublin. He's a creative writing teacher and co-founder of the Inklinks project, a writing initiative for young writers. He was a co-founder and board member also of Lingo, Ireland's first spoken word festival. He's going to read 2 selected poems from his latest collection, Randomer.
How's it going? What is the crack? It's mad to be here, you know, like in the centre of what was our colonisers, to be something supposedly different. And I think, you know, I think it's just interesting to think about that, to think of where we are, where we sit amongst standing up for people who need our support, who are very far away from the centre of power. And I'll just keep it simple, because I've so many thoughts going through my head because of that unbelievable panel that I didn't realise was going to happen to me tonight. And I'm kind of incredibly motivated and stirred, so I need to take a second to settle, and no better way to just read the poem. Do you remember Deccan? Do you remember everyone was mad about Deccan? Do you remember the Celtic Tiger was like, have you got Deccan out your back? You need some out your front. Did you get some around the side? You should put Deccan in the kitchen. Deccan everywhere. It was like everyone went mad with Deccan. Like, what was going on? Like this collective hysteria. And we were being sold the pig in a poke, this idea that you need a mortgage. You get a mortgage, you need another mortgage. We don't have 4 mortgages, you know. It just kept going. And the Deccan, I thought, was a mad symbol of what was happening to us in Ireland before the crash. So I'll read that poem, talk a little bit about it then after. So, decking. You bought it with borrowed money, hired some foreign bodies to install it, while building onto the house you spent so much time telling your friends about how much it cost, how they ought not to fall anywhere short of how far you've gone doing unto others what others do unto you. Off you vaulted yourself into the realm of credit, the second mortgage, the life forever inventing itself on the billboard. You'd only finished constructing it all, and then, like this shock of freakish weather, the ocean conveyor slowing, the ice caps melting, the aurora borealis slipping down from the north, the merry-go-round of easy money stopped. All through that one last summer, like a course, the rain kept falling, so many cataclysmic drops per day. And now, the extension roof is leaking, cracks creep through the walls, and your decking won't support a single step, is covered in reptile green slime, lies silent like a criminal outside, waiting for you to crack your coccyx, break your aging hip, or put a chip in that corruptible Irish smile of yours that started it all. Thank you. I think there was, around the time I wrote that poem, just realising how angry I was at the time that we were all being told that the most important thing to do was, you know, like get invested, like stretch yourself out on credit, you know. And I remember around that time, there was two fellas driving around Clondalkin in a van, and they'd kind of stop and they'd go, do you want to buy an iPhone? Do you want to buy an iPhone, right? And then they'd give you, they'd kind of show you the iPhone, they'd take it out of the box, you'd look at it, and you'd kind of go, that's deadly, you know. And then they'd kind of go, €50, only €50, and then you'd hand them the 50, and then they'd hand you back the box. But in the middle of it, there was a little bait and switch, and they'd go, brilliant to have an iPhone. You open it, and there was a brick in the box instead. And that's what we're in now. We're in the brick. We're all thinking like this thing we're in is an iPhone, but it's actually a brick, you know, this whole kind of lie that we've been sold for past 10 years, you know. Like if you think of, I feel like that we're in some sort of busted flush where the thing that we used to have has been over time dismantled. The kind of system that we had, the socially kind of engaged, where Ireland saw itself as a family. And I lost a few houses over time. I've been homeless a couple of times, and I had to engage with organisations like CLM. And you know, the old way Ireland used to work was kind of dismantled over time through a thing that we called austerity, but it was kind of something else. It was a bit of a bait and switch. And I think that amazing line that you said, Bernadette, the state has diminished itself in its role of supporting its own systems. Like, it was kind of it's a very sneaky process, and it's great to see organisations that CLM standing up for it now. And if you think of like what was mentioned as well about like what's going on in Palestine, what's going on in Ukraine. I was working in a school in Westport there only the other day, and there was a young Ukrainian man in transition year who'd lost his father to Russian soldiers in Ukraine, and he's living in Westport now. And then, you know, it's like the scale of what's going on is crazy. And the right to a home, so important, and it's so like not really understood by anyone who hasn't lost a home, you know. And I'd just like to take a second to get you to think about that. You know, I have this poem called Springshine, which is just about a house that I used to live in, doesn't exist anymore. That place is gone. It was 2016, and I'm in a really great position now, and I couldn't have seen it coming without the support of people who stepped up and stood up and advocated for me at the time. But like, just to kind of think of, you know, like that lovely spring, it kind of makes you want to clean your house, wash your windows, you know, that lovely spring sunlight. You're like, oh no, it's that spring cleaning time. But it was that lovely light, and it was just a great Tuesday in my house. So the house compacted, then opening up so fast, like a popcorn kernel or a stop-motion flower, exploding with my laughter because of my 4-year-old's first joke, wit like a whip crack flying out of his mouth. In the hall, my daughter spins into a dream of being a gymnast. She flips back, bends, and unfolds herself. The room is stored with her energy. I see her aura moving through the air like slow-motion orbs of water. Her older sister has curled up on the couch, stares into her phone, opens herself as pixels, her feelings sent as letters to an invisible boy. When the tick turns green on her screen, what comes in reply is like a bomb going off in her endocrine system. She walks to the kitchen. Her mother is making spaghetti bolognese. No frills, just a sauce from a jar. Some mince, we like it simple. The steam of it on the walls, the drone of the extractor fan, the small ceremony of cutlery thrown across the table. The daughter helps and can't help smiling. The mother doesn't know why, but smiles as well. This is the soft machine of our life. Last night, the house was warm, without the fucking heating on. And this morning, sunlight woke us, one by one, and the noise of a tin hurtling across the green outside, gunning a scrambler, accelerating, feeling the wind in his hair. Inside his engine, small bursts of fire, while his tires run over the grass. In the dark, beneath us all, new bulbs push hard against the clay. Thank you. Thanks.